I worked the celebrity life. Green rooms, backstage, private conversations with people whose faces are on billboards and screens all over the world. That was inside the entertainment industry. Film, television, media, all at a high level. I wasn't a familiar face, but I was part of what made it work. And I was good at it. So when that stopped, there wasn't a version of me outside of that waiting. If you took that life away, there wasn't a clean answer to who I was. And I don't mean that in a vague or existential way. I mean very literally. This isn't a story about burnout. It's about what happens when your identity is built inside your work. And then, past 50, you have to live your life without it. Alone. Now, I live out here. And most days, they're quiet. Quiet enough that there's nothing to measure myself against. And it turns out that is not as peaceful as it sounds. This is not a story about burnout. It's what happens when your identity mainly exists inside your work and you have to figure out who you are without it. I spent over 20 years working inside celebrity life, which is a very specific kind of environment that only makes sense when you're inside of it. I wasn't the person being photographed, but I was close enough that I saw how everything actually worked. The decisions, the pressure, the constant recalibrating toward, what's next. My job was to make things function, to solve problems, to manage complexity, to keep the momentum going and be creative. And I was good at it. I was good at it in a way that didn't feel accidental. It felt earned. It made sense to me. The more competent I became, the more everything in my life started to organize itself around that role. And I didn't do that consciously. It just sort of happened. You become the person who can handle things, and eventually, that stops being something you do and starts being who you are. I spent over 20 years working inside celebrity life, which is a very specific kind of environment that only makes sense when you're inside of it. I wasn't the person being photographed, but I was close enough that I saw how everything actually worked. The decisions, the pressure, the constant recalibrating toward, what's next. My job was to make things function, to solve problems, to manage complexity, to keep the momentum going and be creative. And I was good at it. I was good at it in a way that didn't feel accidental. It felt earned. It made sense to me. The more competent I became, the more everything in my life started to organize itself around that role. And I didn't do that consciously. It just sort of happened. You become the person who can handle things, and eventually, that stops being something you do and starts being who you are, which is great, until it's the only thing that you are. I knew how to ambition. It felt like success. The friction wasn't that I was busy. The friction was that everything that made me feel like I had value only existed inside that system. So the moment I wasn't actively working or needed or solving something, there was nothing left to measure myself against. And when that happens, you don't feel relaxed. You don't feel free. You feel irrelevant. That's the part people don't really talk about when they talk about success or productivity or burnout. It's not just exhaustion, it's dependency. You become dependent on being useful to feel like you exist in a meaningful way. And being needed feels exactly like having purpose. It's convincing. It explains everything. It gives structure to your life in a way that feels real. So you don't question it. You don't stop and ask if you actually want that life, because wanting it is already built into the system. Of course you want it. Why wouldn't you? That question, do I want this, just quietly disappears. And I got very used to that. Used to being busy, being effective, being important in ways that were extremely visible and measurable. I assumed I would just keep going like that, expand it, get better at it, stay inside of it. There was never a plan to leave. There wasn't even a thought that leaving was something that would happen. And then, very efficiently, my life stopped matching that structure. Not in a cinematic way, not in a moment where everything becomes clear and you make a decision. It was more like reality just started removing the conditions that made life possible. You know, marriage, and then the pandemic, and then we had twins, and then an ugly divorce. It's just a sequence of events that made it increasingly obvious that the version of my life that I had built wasn't the one I was actually living. Not anymore. I didn't handle that gracefully, as you can probably imagine, because I wasn't looking for a slower life. I wasn't secretly hoping to step away and rediscover myself. That wasn't my goal, not even close. My goal was more of what I was already doing, just at an even higher level. So this wasn't a brave exit. It certainly wasn't intentional reinvention, you know. It was me trying to stay in a life that was already ending because that was the only version of myself that made sense. And I went kicking and screaming. Even now, I still miss it. I still miss parts of it. Not so much in a nostalgic way, but I understand exactly what it was that I was doing, but I do miss the clarity and the pace and the feeling of knowing exactly where I fit. What replaced it wasn't clarity, it was space. And space looks good until you're actually in it. Because space doesn't tell you who you are. It just removes everything you were using to avoid that question. For a while, that felt like failure, like I had stepped out of something that worked and into something that didn't have a role for me. My brain did not enjoy that transition. No structure, no urgency, no external validation. It's like taking away the entire operating system and expecting everything to run smoothly anyway. But after a while, nothing else started happening. Not a breakthrough. There was never a clean realization. Just small moments where I noticed that nothing bad happened if I didn't turn everything into something productive. Nothing collapsed if I didn't optimize the day. Nothing broke if I wasn't useful for a few hours. And that is a very quiet shift, but it changes something. Because you start to realize that this feeling of needing to prove your value constantly might not actually be necessary. I think the shift, if there is one, is that I'm starting to separate being valuable from being useful. And those are not actually the same thing. I was very useful for a long time, and that was very measurable. It was visible. It made sense to other people, but I didn't have a clear sense of whether I was okay outside of that. And now I'm in a life where I'm not particularly useful most of the time, at least not in the way that I used to be. And I'm starting to notice I still exist. I still have a life. I still have a sense of self that really isn't entirely dependent on output. I mean, it's not clean, it's certainly not resolved. I'm not on the other side of anything. But, it's different in a way that feels real. And for the first time in a long time, I'm not trying to immediately turn that into something bigger or more impressive. I mean, how could you? I know what this kind of story sounds like from the outside. It's supposed to end with clarity or purpose or some version of this is what actually matters. I'm not doing that. I'm not here to tell you to slow down or redefine your life or find meaning in something simpler. I don't think those things can be handed to someone else in a way that actually works. What I can do is show you what this looks like. What it looks like when someone who built their identity around work and productivity ends up somewhere completely different and stays long enough to see what's actually there. Not because I figured it out, because this is where I am. I spent most of my life building something that looked like success. And this is the part where I figure out if any of that was actually mine. No big plans. That's the show. I'll see you Friday.